The rain lashed against the tall, Gothic windows of his office, the sound of frantic heartbeat against the heavy silence within. His desk, a formidable fortress of oak that usually held nothing more scandalous than graded papers and leather-bound classics, was now our altar. My back was pressed against a chaotic landscape of literary theory and student essays, each page a silent, judging witness to our sin. The air was thick, a heady cocktail of old paper, worn leather, and the uniquely intoxicating scent of him, of Julian. His breath was hot against my neck, a low groan vibrating from his chest into mine as his fingers tangled possessively in my honey-colored hair. I could see his diplomas on the wall, framed in dark wood, his name, Dr. Julian Croft, inscribed in elegant script, a name that commanded respect in the light of day, but was now just a desperate whisper on my lips in the encroaching darkness. Every stolen touch, every suppressed cry of pleasure was a betrayal, a reckless step off the safe, predictable path I had spent my entire life building. In that moment, suspended between ecstasy and terror, a single, devastating question clawed its way through the fog of desire. How did I get here? Just 3 months earlier, my life was a perfectly straight line, drawn with a steady hand. I was Alara, the diligent student, the dependable girlfriend. My world was a cozy, well-lit room, and in it was Mark. Mark, my boyfriend of 4 years, was the blueprint for a happy life, the kind our parents dreamed of for us. He was solid, kind, and his love for me was as comfortable and reliable as a Sunday morning. Our future was a foregone conclusion. Graduation, a ring, a house in a quiet suburb. It was a beautiful picture, but lately, I had begun to feel as though I was admiring it from behind a pane of glass, unable to feel its warmth. And then there was him, Professor Julian Croft. He wasn't a part of my picture. He was the artist who suddenly made me realize my canvas was too small. In the grand lecture hall, he was less a man and more an intellectual force, weaving magic from the words of long-dead poets. His voice, a low, mesmerizing cadence, could hold 200 students captive. I admired him, from a safe distance, the way one admires a distant, magnificent storm. He was my professor. He was married. He was a world away from my simple, straight line. It was my final semester at the university, the New England air crisp with the promise of endings and new beginnings. I thought I knew exactly which beginning was mine. I was wrong. I was so profoundly, devastatingly wrong. The lecture hall was emptying, a slow tide of students receding with the shuffling of papers and the murmur of afternoon plans, leaving behind a quiet shoreline of silence. I remained in my seat, an anchor in the emptying room, my fingers tracing the faded inscription on my wooden desk. The low autumn sun slanted through the cavernous windows, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air like tiny, forgotten stars. At the front of the room, Professor Croft was methodically gathering his notes, placing them into a worn leather satchel. The ordinary sounds he made, the soft click of the clasps, the rustle of paper, seemed amplified in the stillness, each one a small, intimate detail in a space that was usually so public. My heart was a nervous drum against my ribs, but my mind was resolute. The question had been burning in me for days, a complex knot in my understanding of T.S. Eliot's The Wasteland, a poem that felt less like an assignment and more like a diagnosis of a sickness I hadn't known I had. Finally, I stood, my footsteps echoing unnervingly on the worn floorboards as I approached the lectern. He looked up, his movements pausing. His eyes, the color of rich, dark coffee, held a flicker of surprise before settling into the familiar, professional warmth he offered all his students. "Miss Vance," he said, his voice the same resonant baritone that held us all spellbound twice a week. "Can I help you?" I clutched my book to my chest like a shield. "Professor, I'm sorry to keep you. It's about the poem. The final section, What the Thunder Said. I understand the allusions, the Sanskrit, but I feel like I'm missing the emotional core. It feels like the poem is giving up, but Eliot is still fighting for something. Is it a prayer for rain, or is it the terrified acceptance that the rain will never come?" He was silent for a moment, his gaze shifting from my face to a point somewhere in the middle distance, as if he were rereading the verses in his mind. Most professors would have given a textbook answer, a quick academic interpretation before hurrying on with their day. But Julian Croft didn't. He leaned one hip against the lectern, crossing his arms. The posture was casual, yet it seemed to draw all the energy in the room toward him. That's a very astute question, Alara. He used my first name, and the sound of it, spoken in his voice without the formal title of Miss, was a tiny, unexpected shock. Most people see only the despair. They see the fragmented world and assume the poet is as broken as his creation. But you're right, it's not resignation. It's a desperate act of shoring fragments against one's ruins. He's gathering the broken pieces of civilization, of faith, of love, and trying to build a shelter, however fragile. As he spoke, something shifted. The space between us was no longer just the gap between student and teacher. It became charged, intimate. He wasn't lecturing, he was conversing, sharing a piece of himself. The rain, he continued, his voice dropping slightly, becoming softer, isn't just water, it's grace. It's connection, it's meaning in a meaningless world. And the poem doesn't answer whether it will come. It leaves us there, in the parched landscape, listening to the thunder. The thunder is the promise, you see, but it's also the threat. That's where the tension lies. That's the genius of it. His eyes found mine again, and this time, they weren't just the eyes of a professor, they were the eyes of a man. A man who understood what it meant to live in a parched landscape, listening for a storm that might save you or destroy you. In that moment, I felt an overwhelming sense of being truly, completely seen. Mark loved me, but he saw the girl he'd been dating since freshman year. My parents saw their dutiful daughter. Julian Croft, in the space of a 5-minute conversation, saw the landscape of my mind. I never thought of it that way, I stammered, my carefully constructed academic question dissolving into a simple, honest admission. The promise and the threat. A small, sad smile touched the corner of his mouth. They are often the same thing, aren't they? The air crackled. The professional mask was gone, and in its place was a vulnerability that was far more captivating than his intellectual authority. I became acutely aware of everything. The way the gray in his hair caught the light at his temples, the faint lines around his eyes that spoke of long nights spent reading, the scent of his cologne, a subtle, sophisticated blend of sandalwood and something else, something I couldn't name but felt inherently masculine, grown up. He pushed himself off the lectern and took a step closer, ostensibly to look at the passage in my book which I was still clutching. His fingers brushed against mine as he pointed to a line, and a jolt, sharp and electric, shot up my arm. I pulled my hand back as if I'd been burned. Our eyes met, and the world seemed to stop. The lecture hall, the setting sun, the life I had outside this room, it all faded away. There was only the charged space between us, filled with unspoken things. His gaze was intense, searching. It traveled from my eyes, down to my cheek, and then, for a heartbeat that stretched into an eternity, it rested on my lips. It was the briefest of moments, but it was a confession. It was a question, and I knew with a terrifying certainty that my answer was already written all over my face. In that lingering look, a line was crossed. No words were said, no promises made, but a silent, dangerous covenant had been formed. He saw my thirst, and I saw his. He was the thunder, and I was the dry ground, praying for a rain I knew would utterly ruin me. He cleared his throat, the sound unnaturally loud, and stepped back, the spell breaking. You have a fine mind, Alara. Don't ever let anyone tell you otherwise. The formality was back, but it was a flimsy shield, and we both knew it. Thank you, Professor, I whispered, my voice barely audible. I turned and walked away, my legs feeling unsteady beneath me. I didn't look back, but I could feel his eyes on me with every step. As I pushed open the heavy doors and stepped out into the cool autumn air, I knew I hadn't just left a lecture hall. I had left the edge of my old life behind, and I had just taken my first step into the wasteland. The days that followed were a quiet torment. Every time I saw him on campus, My stomach would perform a slow, sickening flip. Our shared glance in the lecture hall had become a secret I carried around, a warm, heavy stone in my pocket. I replayed our conversation 100 times, dissecting every word, every pause, searching for a meaning I was both hoping and terrified to find. I tried to focus on my life, on Mark, on the comfortable future that awaited me. We went out for dinner, and as he spoke about interest rates and quarterly reports, I found my mind drifting back to a dusty room and a conversation about broken poetry. Mark's hand would cover mine on the table, a familiar, comforting weight, but all I could think about were Julian's eyes and the unspoken promise of a storm. Then, the email arrived. The subject line was innocuous. Continuing our discussion, my heart hammered against my ribs as I opened it. The message was brief, professional. He wrote that he had been impressed by my insights and, as the semester's major paper was approaching, he would be happy to offer some informal mentorship. He suggested coffee. Off campus. My mind raced, searching for the hidden meaning between the lines. Was this truly a professor helping a promising student, or was it something else? I knew. Of course, I knew. The voice of reason, the one that sounded a lot like my mother, screamed at me to decline politely, to run back to the safety of my straight-line life. But another voice, a quieter, more seductive whisper, urged me forward. I typed back a simple, "I would like that very much," and with those 6 words, I sealed my fate. We met at a place called The Gilded Page, a cozy, dimly lit bookstore cafe several blocks from the university. It was our neutral ground, a small island of anonymity where we were not professor and student, but simply a man and a woman. The air inside smelled of roasting coffee beans and aging paper, a scent I immediately associated with him. He was already there, tucked away in a secluded booth in the back, a book open in front of him. When he saw me, he smiled, and the practiced, public smile he wore on campus was replaced by something genuine, something that made the lines around his eyes crinkle. It made him look younger, and dangerously more human. "Alara," he said, his voice a low rumble that was almost lost beneath the soft jazz playing in the background. "I'm glad you came." I slid into the booth, the worn leather cool against my skin. For a few moments, we hid behind the safety of academia. We discussed my paper topic, dissecting Virginia Woolf with a surgical precision. He was brilliant, effortlessly drawing connections and offering perspectives that left me breathless. He listened to my ideas with an intensity that made me feel like the most interesting person in the world. With him, my mind felt alive, sharp, every thought polished until it shone. He made me feel not just smart, but seen. Then, as the waitress refilled our cups, the shift happened. He leaned back, his coffee mug cradled in his long, scholarly hands. "So," he began, his tone shifting from academic to personal, "what happens for Alara Vance after all this? After the papers are graded and the gown is put away?" I gave him the rehearsed answer, the one I gave everyone. "Mark, my boyfriend, has a great job in Boston. The plan is to move there with him. I'll find a job in publishing probably, settle down." Even as I said it, the words sounded hollow, a script written by someone else. Julian watched me, his gaze unwavering. He didn't offer congratulations or polite encouragement. He just watched, as if he could see the lie behind my eyes. "Is that the life you want?" he asked softly. "Or is it the life you think you're supposed to want?" The question struck me with the force of a physical blow. No one had ever asked me that before. I opened my mouth to defend my choices, to defend Mark, but no words came out. He saved me from having to answer. He looked down into his coffee, a shadow passing over his features. "We spend our youth striving for a destination we've been told is beautiful," he said, his voice laced with a profound melancholy. "And some of us are lucky enough to get there, only to find ourselves living in a postcard, perfect to look at, but flat, lifeless." In that moment, he opened a door into his own world, and I stepped through without hesitation. He spoke of intellectual loneliness, of being married to a good woman, he was careful to call her, a good woman who appreciated his success but had no interest in the inner world where he truly lived. "You can spend your life studying the great, messy, tragic passions of literature," he murmured, his eyes finding mine again, and then come home to a reality written in sensible, boring prose. It's a peculiar kind of exile. He wasn't complaining. He was confessing, and he had chosen me as his priest. I felt a powerful, intoxicating surge of connection, a dangerous empathy. I wanted to reach across the table, to place my hand over his and tell him that I understood. I too felt the flatness. I too longed for poetry. My relationship with Mark, once a source of comfort, now felt like that sensible, boring prose Julian was describing. The guilt was a dull throb in the back of my mind, a distant alarm bell I was choosing to ignore. All I could focus on was the man in front of me, this brilliant, sad man who was showing me his soul. I became hyper-aware of him, of the small space that separated us. I watched the way his thumb stroked the ceramic of his mug. I watched the way his throat moved when he swallowed his coffee. His knee brushed against mine under the table, a fleeting, accidental touch that sent a wildfire racing through my veins. We both froze, our eyes locking. The air grew thick with unspoken words. The soft jazz, the smell of coffee, the murmur of other patrons, it all faded into a distant hum. There was only his gaze, dark and intense, and the frantic beating of my own heart. He didn't move his knee away, neither did I. His eyes dropped to my mouth, just as they had in the lecture hall, but this time it was slower, more deliberate. A silent question that I answered by leaning forward ever so slightly. The world narrowed to the inches between us, and I was sure he was going to kiss me. I wanted him to. I wanted it with an ache that was terrifying and new, but he didn't. He drew a slow breath and pulled back, breaking the spell. He placed a few bills on the table. "Thank you for the conversation, Alara," he said, his voice husky. "It's been illuminating." That word again. The conversation was over, but something immense had just begun. As I walked out of the Gilded Page and back into the crisp autumn afternoon, I felt fundamentally changed. The world looked different, sharper, more vibrant. I had crossed a line, not with a touch, but with a confession. I was no longer just his student. I was his secret keeper. And I knew, with a certainty, that both thrilled and terrified me that this was only the beginning. The week after our coffee was a lesson in exquisite torture. I was living a half-life, my body moving through its routine classes, meals with Mark, conversations with friends, while my mind was perpetually trapped in a dimly lit cafe, replaying every word, every glance from Julian. I started taking the long way back to my dorm each evening, a path that led me right past the literature department building. I'd linger by the library windows that faced his office, hoping for a glimpse of his silhouette against the light. I told myself it was pathetic, that I was a moth circling a flame, but I couldn't stop. I was an addict, and the memory of his gaze was a drug I craved with a desperation that frightened me. One night, a storm rolled in, a magnificent tempest that mirrored the chaos in my soul. The sky turned a bruised purple, and the wind howled like a grieving animal. While other students hurried home, I felt a pull toward the campus, toward the library. I told myself I needed to study, but it was a lie. I was hunting. I was placing myself in the path of destiny, daring it to strike. I sat in a carrel by the window, watching the rain slant down in silver sheets, my textbook open but unread. The hours bled into one another until the library was nearly empty, the silence broken only by the storm and the frantic thumping of my own heart. It was almost midnight when I finally gathered my things, my disappointment a cold, heavy weight in my stomach. I walked slowly through the deserted hallways, the sound of my own footsteps, a lonely rhythm. As I passed the corridor leading to the faculty offices, a sliver of light appeared, cutting through the darkness. A door opened. It was him. He looked exhausted, his tie loosened, his hair slightly disheveled. He was pulling on a dark tweed overcoat, and for a moment he didn't see me. He was just a man, tired at the end of a long day. Then his eyes lifted and found me standing there, a deer caught in the headlights. A complex expression flickered across his face. Surprise, recognition, and something else. Resignation, as if he knew this moment was inevitable. "Alara," he said, his voice, a low, rough sound. "You shouldn't be here this late. The storm is getting worse." I was studying. I lied. The word feeling flimsy and transparent. I lost track of time. He looked out the hall window at the torrent outside. You can't walk back in this. It's not safe. Let me give you a ride. It wasn't a question. It was a statement. My heart leaped into my throat. You don't have to, I protested weakly, the words a hollow gesture. I insist. The walk to the faculty parking lot was a blur of wind and rain. He held his coat over my head, his arm brushing against my shoulder. The warmth of his body, the faint scent of his cologne mingled with the cold, wet air, was dizzying. We got into his car, a dark, heavy sedan that felt like a sanctuary from the raging storm. He started the engine, and the space was filled with the soft glow of the dashboard and the rhythmic thump, thump, thump of the windshield wipers, a frantic heartbeat counting down to the inevitable. He didn't turn on the radio. The silence between us was immense, a living thing, crackling with all the words we hadn't said. I stared out the window, watching the campus lights blur into streaks of color, hyper-aware of him beside me. I could feel the heat radiating from his body, see the tension in the way his hands gripped the steering wheel. He drove past the turnoff to my dormitory. My breath hitched. My entire body went still. This was it. This was the moment of choice. I could say something. I could tell him he'd missed the turn. But I remained silent. My silence was my consent. My silence was a scream of yes. He kept driving, leaving the familiar campus grounds behind, heading toward the old road that wound its way up to the woods surrounding the town lake. He pulled into a deserted scenic lookout, a spot where teenagers parked their cars to steal kisses and dream of the future. He killed the engine. The only sounds left were the drumming of the rain on the roof and our own ragged breathing. He didn't look at me for a long moment. He just stared out at the dark, churning water of the lake. I have thought of 100 different reasons why this is a terrible idea, he finally said, his voice raw with emotion. My career, my wife, your future, I've listed them all. But none of them matter when I see you. Alara, I can't stop thinking about you. He turned to me then, and in the dim light, I saw the fight was gone from his eyes. There was only a deep, profound hunger. And then he was leaning across the console, and his mouth was on mine. It wasn't a gentle kiss. It was a collision, a desperate, frantic claiming. It was the taste of coffee and rain and weeks of unbearable tension. All my fear, all my guilt, all my carefully constructed reasons why this was wrong evaporated in the searing heat of his touch. My hands flew up, tangling in his damp hair, pulling him closer. A small, broken sound escaped my throat, half sob, half surrender. This was not the gentle exploration of a new love. It was the violent breaking of a dam. His hands were rough, urgent, sliding from my face to my throat, down my back, pulling me impossibly closer. He fumbled with the lever on my seat, pushing it back until I was half lying down. The car was a cramped, awkward space, but we didn't care. His tweed coat was rough against my cheek, my sweater a useless barrier he pushed aside. His cold fingers met the warm skin of my stomach, and I gasped, arching into his touch. Julian, I breathed, his name a prayer on my lips. His mouth left mine to trail a line of fire down my neck as his hands worked at the button of my jeans. There was a moment of panicked resistance, a primal instinct for self-preservation, a whispered, "We can't," that was immediately lost as his fingers slipped beneath the lace of my panties, finding the wet, aching heat of me. My protest died, replaced by a low moan of pure, unadulterated need. The windows were fogging over, encasing us in our own private world of sin. The storm outside was a symphony for our transgression, the car rocking slightly with our frantic movements. It was clumsy and desperate and utterly overwhelming. I was lost, drowning in sensation, in the feel of his body pressing down on mine, in the sound of his ragged breaths mingling with my own. When he finally pushed inside me, it was a searing, perfect friction, a feeling of an emptiness I hadn't known was so vast. I cried out, my nails digging into his shoulders as he moved with a frantic rhythm, a man starved, a man possessed. It was over almost as quickly as it began, a frantic, shuddering release that left us both breathless and trembling. In the sudden quiet that followed, the rain on the roof sounded like applause. We lay there, tangled and disheveled, the air thick with the scent of sex and rain. The reality of what we had just done crashed down on me, cold and terrifying. But beneath the fear, beneath the guilt, a new feeling was blooming, a profound, earth-shattering sense of belonging. I had finally come home to a place I never should have been. The drive back to my dorm was a study in silence. The rain had softened to a gentle drumming on the roof, a quiet, mournful rhythm that seemed to mock the violent symphony of moments before. Julian didn't speak. His hands were tight on the steering wheel, his knuckles white in the intermittent glow of passing streetlights. I sat huddled against the passenger door, the cold of the window seeping into my shoulder. My body was a battlefield of warring sensations, the lingering ache between my legs, a dull, pleasant throb that was a constant reminder of him, the scent of our mingled sweat and his cologne clinging to my skin, the dampness of my clothes. When he pulled up in front of my residence hall, the silence stretched, heavy and suffocating. I didn't know what to say. "Thank you for the ride," seemed absurd. "That was amazing," felt cheap. In the end, I just whispered a barely audible, "Good night." He nodded, his gaze fixed on the windshield. "Alara," he said, his voice a rough, strained sound. "We'll talk." Then I was out of the car, the cold night air a shock to my heated skin, and he was gone, his taillights disappearing into the wet darkness. Waking up the next morning was like surfacing from a deep, turbulent dream. For a blissful, ignorant second, the world was normal. Then, the memory of the car, the rain, the desperate heat of his body crashed down on me with the force of a physical blow. I lay in bed, tracing the faint bruises on my hips, a secret map of our frantic encounter. I felt branded. I showered, scrubbing my skin until it was red, but I couldn't wash away the feeling of his hands on me, the scent of him that seemed to have permeated my very soul. A text message notification chimed on my phone. It was Mark. "Morning, beautiful. Thinking of you. Coffee later?" My stomach twisted into a cold, hard knot of guilt. It was so simple, so innocent, so... Mark. His love was a clear, steady light, and I had just shrouded myself in a darkness so complete, I wasn't sure I'd ever find my way out. I looked at myself in the mirror. It was my face, my eyes, my hair, but the person looking back was a stranger, a liar. Her eyes held a secret knowledge that the girl from yesterday didn't possess. A part of me was horrified by her. Another part was inexplicably, terrifyingly thrilled. The silence from Julian over the next 2 days was a unique and brutal form of torture. With every passing hour, my euphoria curdled into anxiety. Did he regret it? Was he disgusted with me? With himself? Was he going to pretend it never happened, leaving me to deal with the fallout alone? I was a ghost in my own life, my thoughts consumed by him. In class, I couldn't meet his eyes, terrified of what I might see there. Pity, dismissal, or, worst of all, nothing. Then, on Thursday afternoon, the email appeared in my inbox. The subject, meeting. The body was just one line. My office, 5 p.m. We need to talk. It wasn't a request. It was a summons. I walked into his office, the same room where our intellectual spark had first ignited, and found him standing by the window, staring out at the campus. He looked as if he hadn't slept in days. When he turned to face me, his expression was grim, his face a mask of conflict. "Close the door," he said, his voice flat. I did as he asked, the soft click of the latch sounding like a cell door locking. "Alara," he began, pacing behind his desk, creating a barrier between us. "What happened the other night? In the car. It was a colossal mistake, a failure of judgment on my part that was unforgivable." He was reciting a script, the words formal and cold. "I am your professor. I am a married man. I put you in an impossible position, and I cannot apologize enough." I just stood there, my hands clasped in front of me, nodding like a penitent child. "I know," I whispered. It was the storm. It was a moment of madness. We were both lying, desperately trying to reduce the cataclysm we'd started to a simple, explainable event, a freak weather phenomenon of the soul. "It can't happen again," he said, the words sharp. "It absolutely, under any circumstances, cannot happen again. The risks are too great. My career, my life, your entire future. We have to agree that this is over before it even began. He was right. Every word he said was the undeniable, rational truth. I should have felt relieved. I should have agreed and walked out of that office, grateful for the narrow escape. Instead, all I felt was a rising tide of panic, a desperate fear that he was going to take away the most vibrant, real thing I had ever felt. I understand, I said, my voice betraying none of the turmoil inside. And then, the careful construction of our denial began to crumble. He stopped pacing and looked at me, truly looked at me, and the professional mask dissolved. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice softening, laced with genuine concern. Yes, I lied. He saw right through it. He walked around the desk, and the loss of that physical barrier between us changed the energy in the room completely. He stopped just a foot away from me. "No, you're not," he said gently. "Neither am I." That was the admission that broke the dam. All the talk of ending things had been a lie. Now came the truth, disguised as pragmatism. If we were to fail at ending this, he began, the hypothetical, a thin veil, we would have to be extraordinarily careful. He was talking about rules, the rules for how to have an affair. "No one can know," I said, my voice barely a whisper, stepping into the conspiracy with him. "Ever." He nodded. "No contact on campus that isn't strictly academic. We are Professor Croft and Miss Vance. Nothing more. Another rule. No emails, no texts on our regular phones. It's too easy to make a mistake." He was already problem-solving, his brilliant mind applying itself not to literature, but to logistics of adultery. We can only meet in places where no one would know us. Away from here, it would have to be planned. It can't be. Reckless. He was trying to impose order on the chaos, to build a cage for the wild thing that was now between us. We were talking about how not to be together, but every word was a brick in the foundation of our secret life. He had listed all the reasons we had to stay apart, all the boundaries we must not cross. We had agreed. We had been sensible. And then, as I turned to leave, my hand on the doorknob, he said my name, Elara. I turned back. He was standing right behind me, his eyes dark with a desperate, warring emotion. He raised a hand, his fingers hesitating for a moment before they came to rest on my cheek. His touch was electric, a jolt that made my knees feel weak. It was a direct violation of the rules we had just created. All our careful logic, all our sensible resolutions incinerated in that single, simple touch, these rules, he murmured, his voice thick. "I have a terrible feeling we're going to be very bad at following them." And then he leaned down and kissed me. It wasn't like the frantic, desperate kiss in the car. This was slow, deep, and utterly possessive. It was a kiss that sealed a bargain, a kiss that said, "You are mine, and I am yours, and to hell with the consequences." When he finally pulled away, we were both breathless. I left his office without another word, my heart pounding a triumphant, terrifying rhythm. The affair was no longer a hypothetical. It was real. It had rules designed to be broken. I was no longer a girl who had made a mistake. I was a woman who had made a choice. And so, my double life began. By day, I was Elara, the dedicated student, the loving girlfriend. I moved through a world painted in the pale, sensible colors of my future with Mark. We would cook dinner together, our bodies moving in a familiar, comfortable rhythm in the small kitchen of his off-campus apartment. He would talk about his day at the investment firm where he was interning, and I would nod and ask the right questions, my mind a million miles away. I would help him with his tie in the morning, the knot, a familiar, domestic ritual that now felt like a noose tightening around my conscience. He would kiss my forehead and tell me he loved me, and the words, once a source of warmth, now felt like hot coals on my skin. I would smile and say, "I love you too," and the lie would taste like ash in my mouth. Then, there was the other life, the one lived in the shadows. This life was a chiaroscuro of darkness and brilliant, blinding flashes of light. It existed in stolen hours, in hushed whispers, in the sacred illicit space between my body and Julian's. I became an artist of deception, a meticulous architect of lies. My calendar became a work of fiction, filled with phantom study groups and imaginary thesis meetings. "I have to pull an all-nighter at the library," I'd tell Mark, kissing him goodbye, the guilt, a physical weight in my chest. Then I would walk to Julian's office, my heart a frantic drum against my ribs, the anticipation a heady, intoxicating drug. His office became our sanctuary. After the last of the faculty had gone home and the campus had fallen into a quiet hush, I would slip through the darkened hallways and tap softly on his door. He would open it, and for a few hours, the world and all its rules would cease to exist. We would draw the heavy velvet curtains, and in the soft glow of his desk lamp, the imposing room of intellect and authority would transform into our private haven. He loved to watch me, his gaze a physical touch that set my skin on fire. "Take your hair down," he would whisper, and I would pull the pin from the severe bun I wore for my daily life, letting my hair cascade over my shoulders. He said it was like watching me shed a costume, revealing the real woman beneath. He taught me about my own beauty through the lens of his desire. He would trace the curve of my shoulder with his fingertip and call it the most elegant line in nature. He once told me, his voice thick with a mixture of reverence and lust, that the sight of my simple black lace bra against the backdrop of his first edition novels was an irony so perfect it was a form of poetry. We made love on the plush leather couch in front of his fireplace, the shadows dancing on our skin, our hushed cries of pleasure swallowed by the thick, soundproofed walls. The risk was part of the allure, the knowledge that discovery was only a janitor's key turn away. Sometimes, we would escape the confines of the campus, driving an hour to a neighboring town where we were just two anonymous strangers. We'd check into a cheap, impersonal motel, the kind with worn carpets and questionable art on the walls. But in those rooms, we found a different kind of freedom. There was no need to whisper, no fear of a knock on the door. I could cry his name out loud in the peak of my pleasure, and he could explore every inch of my body with a slow, deliberate worship that left me undone. In those anonymous rooms, I wasn't Mark's girlfriend or Professor Croft's student. I was just a woman, alive and alight with a passion I never knew I was capable of. But the thrill of the secret was always shadowed by the terror of exposure. I lived in a state of constant, low-grade anxiety, my phone a potential bomb in my pocket. Every unexpected text from Mark sent a jolt of ice through my veins. And then, one night, the bomb nearly detonated. We were in his office, lost in each other. I was on his desk, his books pushed aside, his body a heavy, wonderful weight on mine. We were reckless, drunk on desire and the false sense of security our sanctuary provided. In my haste, I had left my phone in the pocket of my coat, thrown carelessly over a chair. It buzzed once. We ignored it. It buzzed again. A persistent, angry vibration against the silent room. A cold dread began to seep through the heat of the moment. Julian froze above me. "You should check that," he whispered, his voice strained. I scrambled off the desk, my hands trembling as I pulled the phone from my pocket. It was a text from Mark. My blood ran cold. "Hey, my study session ran late too. I'm on campus and grabbed you a coffee. Surprise! Which library are you in?" Panic, pure and absolute, seized me. He was here, on campus, looking for me. My mind raced, a frantic scramble for a plausible story. Julian was already pulling on his shirt, his face pale and grim. The romantic lover was gone, replaced by a man facing the potential ruin of his life. "Think," he hissed, his voice sharp. "Where would you be?" "The main library, 3rd floor," I choked out, my fingers flying across the screen, typing a reply that I prayed sounded casual. "Oh no, we just finished up a few minutes ago. I'm walking back to the dorm now. Rain check on the coffee? Meet you at my place?" I hit send, my heart hammering against my ribs. It was a race. We had less than 10 minutes to erase any trace of me from his office, for me to get across the rain-slicked quad and get back to my dorm before he could somehow discover I was never at the library. We moved in a silent, frantic panic, tidying the desk, smoothing the couch cushions. He gave me one last hard look. "Go. Don't run. Walk normally." I slipped out of his office and into the empty hall, my entire body screaming with adrenaline. The walk across campus was the longest of my life. Every shadow seemed to hold a threat. When I finally burst into my dorm room, I had seconds to spare before there was a knock on the door. It was Mark, smiling, holding a now tepid cup of coffee. "Hey, I was just over by the library, but I must have just missed you." He leaned in to kiss me. I had to force myself not to flinch, to kiss him back, all while the scent of Julian was still on my skin, the feel of him still a phantom touch on my body. In that moment, holding Mark's coffee and returning his innocent kiss, the thrill of my secret life curdled into something ugly and toxic. This wasn't a game. It was a high-wire act over a canyon of devastation, and for the first time, I had truly, terrifyingly looked down. The close call with Mark was like a plunge into icy water. For a week, we were ghosts to each other, communicating only through strained, professional nods in the hallway. The terror of that night had been a brutal lesson in the reality of our situation. The thrill that had sustained me was replaced by a gnawing, visceral fear. I thought, for a few days, that the fear would be enough to end it. I thought the memory of my trembling hands as I lied to Mark's smiling face would sever the cord that bound me to Julian. I was wrong. The fear, I discovered, was a powerful aphrodisiac. The near catastrophe didn't push us apart. It fused our secret to us, made it a more integral part of our identity. The risk wasn't a deterrent. It was the price of admission to the only world where I felt truly alive. And after a week of starving, the hunger was more ravenous than ever. The invitation came not as an email, but as a small, folded note he slipped into my hand as he returned a paper to me in class, his fingers brushing mine for a fraction of a second too long. There was no greeting, no signature, just an address, a room number, and a time, the Blackwood Inn. It was a historic boutique hotel in a picturesque town, an hour's drive away, a place people went for romantic weekend getaways. This was different from his office, different from the anonymous, slightly seedy motels. This was a destination. This was a planned, deliberate indulgence in our sin. It was a statement. What we had was no longer a frantic, accidental collision, but a conscious, cultivated obsession. I arrived at 4 o'clock on Friday, my heart a slow, heavy drum. Room 207 was at the end of a quiet, carpeted hallway. The room itself was beautiful, a world away from our previous encounters. A magnificent 4-poster bed dominated the space, draped in rich, dark fabrics. A fire was already crackling in the hearth, casting a warm, dancing glow on the walls. And he was there, standing by the window, a glass of red wine in his hand, waiting for me. He didn't rush to me. He just watched me as I closed the door behind me, his eyes taking in every detail. The room was our cocoon, insulating us from the outside world. He handed me a glass of wine. "I'm glad you came," he said, his voice a low, intimate murmur. We didn't talk about Mark, or his wife, or the university. They didn't exist here. Here, there was only us. After a few sips of wine, he took the glass from my hand and set it aside. "Turn around," he whispered. I obeyed, my back to him, my gaze fixed on the flickering flames in the fireplace. I heard him step behind me, felt the warmth of his body close to mine. His fingers went to the zipper at the back of my dress, and he drew it down with an agonizing slowness, the cold metal teeth a stark contrast to the heat building on my skin. He pushed the fabric off my shoulders, his lips following the path of the falling dress, kissing the nape of my neck, the curve of my shoulder blade. "You are so beautiful, Alara," he breathed against my skin. A masterpiece. The dress pooled at my feet, and I stood before him in nothing but my black lingerie. This was not a hurried, frantic undressing in the dark. This was an unveiling, an act of worship. He led me to the bed, laying me down on the cool, high-thread couch sheets. For a long time, he just looked at me, his eyes memorizing me. Then he began his lesson. His touch was different this time, not the desperate grasp of our first encounters, but the knowing, deliberate caress of a master craftsman. He taught me the secret language of my own body. His fingers traced paths of fire from my ankle to my inner thigh. His mouth found the sensitive skin behind my knee, the hollow of my throat. He took his time, exploring every inch of me, as if he were discovering a new continent. When his lips finally moved lower, parting the lace of my panties, a helpless sob escaped my throat. I was dissolving, my defenses melting away under the relentless, skillful assault of his tongue. My hips arched off the bed, my fingers tangling in the sheets. I was lost in a world of pure sensation, my body weeping with a pleasure so intense it was almost pain. My little haven was already soaked for him, a testament to his devastating skill. "Julian," I gasped, my mind fracturing. "Please, I can't." He looked up at me, his eyes dark with triumph. "Oh, you can," he murmured against me. "We're just getting started." When I was trembling on the edge of oblivion, he moved up my body, his own need a palpable force. I reached for him, my hands frantic now. "Julian, now, please. I want you inside me." He entered me slowly, a deep, perfect joining that felt like coming home. We moved together in a rhythm that was both primal and profound, our eyes locked, our souls bared. This wasn't just sex. It was a conversation, a possession. Deeper, I pleaded, my voice a ragged whisper. "Please, don't stop. Oh God. Yes, right there." He answered not with words, but by driving into me with a controlled power that stole the breath from my lungs. I could feel my climax building, a massive wave-gathering force from the depths of my being. "Look at me, Alara," he commanded, his voice strained. I met his gaze, and as the wave crashed, shattering me into a million brilliant pieces, I cried out his name, my body convulsing around him. His own release came moments later, a guttural groan torn from his throat as he collapsed against me, his essence flooding me. We lay tangled in the sheets for a long time afterward, the fire crackling, our breathing slowly returning to normal. He didn't pull away. He held me, his hand stroking my hair, his lips pressing gentle kisses to my temple. This intimacy, this tenderness in the afterglow was more dangerous than the passion itself. It felt real. It felt like love. Lying there, wrapped in his arms, feeling utterly and completely his, a cold sliver of truth pierced the warm fog of my bliss. This beautiful room was just a stage. The fire, the wine, the tenderness, it was all part of a stolen, temporary script. Soon I would have to put my costume back on and return to my other life, the one where I was a good girl who didn't sleep with her married professor. The obsession was no longer just about the desperate, thrilling sex. It was about this feeling of being utterly seen, worshipped, and understood. And I knew, with a terrifying certainty, that I would do anything to feel it again. I left the Blackwood Inn floating on a cloud of decadent bliss. The world outside our hotel room seemed muted and slow, a black and white film compared to the vibrant, saturated technicolor of the life I lived in Julian's arms. The tenderness of our afterglow had fundamentally altered the narrative of our affair in my mind. This was no longer just a sordid secret, a series of desperate physical encounters. It was a connection, a meeting of souls. I had been given access to the real Julian, the lonely poet trapped inside the esteemed professor, and I was the only one who could set him free. I convinced myself that his marriage was a hollow shell, a business arrangement, and that I, Alara, was the secret beating heart of his life. The delusion was so beautiful, so intoxicating, that I mistook it for the truth. This feeling of untouchable, secret significance carried me through the following week. I was a queen in disguise, moving through the common world with a secret crown on my head. The invitation to the dean's annual fall reception was a mark of distinction, a nod to my academic standing. I accepted without a second thought the idea of being in the same room as Julian, sharing the same air in a public space, sending an illicit thrill through me. I imagined us exchanging a charged, secret glance across the crowded room, a silent acknowledgement of our hidden world that no one else could see. I spent hours choosing a dress, a simple but elegant sheath of dark blue silk that clung to my body. I wanted to look beautiful, not for the dean or my other professors, but for him. I wanted him to see me and feel that familiar, possessive ache. When I arrived, the reception was in full swing, a sea of tweed jackets, polite laughter, and the clinking of wine glasses. The air was thick with the scent of money, academia, and ambition. I felt a nervous energy, a hunter's alertness, as my eyes scanned the crowd for him. And then I saw him, He was standing near the grand fireplace holding a glass of whiskey, deep in conversation with the dean. He wasn't the tender, slightly rumpled man from the hotel room. This was Dr. Julian Croft in his full, formidable power. He wore a perfectly tailored charcoal suit, his salt and pepper hair was impeccably styled, and he commanded the attention of everyone around him with an effortless charisma. He laughed at something the dean said, a confident, public laugh that I had never heard before. It wasn't the low, intimate chuckle he saved for me. A small, cold knot began to form in my stomach. This was his world, his kingdom, and I was just a visitor with a temporary pass. Then, a woman approached him, and the knot in my stomach tightened into a fist of ice. She was elegant, her silver hair styled in a chic bob, her figure graceful in a tasteful black dress adorned with a single string of pearls. She moved with an unshakable air of belonging, of ownership. She placed a hand on Julian's arm, and he turned to her, his public smile softening into something different. I knew, with a sickening certainty, that this was her. Amelia Croft, his wife. She was not what I had imagined. In my mind, she was a vague, frumpy figure, the loveless warden of his domestic prison, but the woman before me was beautiful, poised, and formidable. She was his equal. They looked, to the outside world, like a perfect couple, a portrait of success and partnership. I became a statue, my wine glass frozen halfway to my lips, my entire being focused on the two of them. I was a spy in the house of my own heartbreak, desperately searching for the cracks in their facade, the signs of the loveless prose he had described to me. I watched as he leaned in to hear what she was saying, the gesture intimate and familiar. I watched as she laughed, a light, musical sound, and playfully straightened his tie. To my jealous, dissecting eyes, it all seemed like a performance. His smile didn't quite reach his eyes. His posture was a little too stiff. Their intimacy felt like a well-rehearsed play. I had to believe it was a lie, because if it wasn't, then everything he had told me, everything I had built our secret world upon, was the real fiction. The dean gestured to a university photographer who raised his camera to capture the power couple. Amelia's hand tightened on Julian's arm, and they both smiled, a seamless, practiced display for the camera. Looking at them, frozen in that perfect public moment, I felt a wave of nausea. I was the one who was out of place. I was the dirty little secret, the footnote to their grand, established story. Just then, Julian's eyes broke from the small circle of conversation and began to scan the room. My breath caught in my throat. Our gazes met across the crowded floor. For one, heart-stopping, eternal second, the world fell away. This was it. The secret glance I had dreamed of. I expected a flicker of recognition, a shadow of the man who had worshipped my body by firelight, a silent acknowledgement of us. I got nothing. His eyes, the same eyes that had looked at me with such raw hunger, became cool, distant, and utterly unreadable. He gave me a polite, almost imperceptible nod, the same generic, dismissive nod a king might give to a distant, unimportant subject in his court. Then, he turned back to his wife, back to his conversation, back to his life, leaving me standing alone in the wreckage of my delusion. The pain was so sharp and sudden, it felt like a physical stabbing. He had erased me. In a single, effortless gesture, he had relegated me to my official role. Miss Vance. Just another student with a crush. The intimacy we had shared, his whispered confessions, the name I had cried out in his arms, it all meant nothing here, in the real world. Humiliation washed over me, hot and suffocating. I felt naive. I felt cheap. I felt like the biggest fool in a room full of intelligent people. The polite chatter around me became a deafening roar. The elegant room felt like a cage. I had to get out. I mumbled an excuse to the professor I had been talking to and practically fled the reception hall, pushing my way through the oblivious, smiling crowd. I didn't stop until I was outside, the cold November air a brutal shock against my heated skin. I stood there, shivering in my beautiful silk dress, as the shattering truth settled into my bones. I was not the secret heart of his life. I was not his escape, his poetry, his soulmate. I was his hobby, his transgression. I was a secret to be kept, and in the light of day, a liability to be ignored. The queen with the secret crown was just a foolish girl, and her kingdom was nothing but a lie. The week following the reception was a silent, bitter war. I entombed myself in ice, building a wall of cold fury around my wounded heart. I stopped taking the long way past his office. In his lecture, I moved from my customary seat in the third row to the very back of the hall, a distant, anonymous figure in the shadows. My adoration had curdled into a resentful poison. Every time he stood at the lectern, speaking of passion and tragedy and literature, I felt a white-hot rage. He was a hypocrite, a performer. The man who had dissected my body and soul with such tender reverence had, with a single, dismissive nod, dissected my worth and found it to be nothing. He made no effort to contact me, no attempt to explain. The silence was his verdict. I was disposable. And with each passing day, my heartbreak hardened into a brittle, dangerous resolve. I would not be disposed of so quietly. I would not be a secret he could simply shelve like a forgotten book. I needed a confrontation. I needed to see his face when I threw the shards of my shattered illusion at his feet. I waited for him after his last class on Friday. The students filed out, their chatter fading down the hallway, leaving us alone in the vast, empty lecture hall. The air was thick with the ghosts of our first real conversation. He was packing his satchel, his back to me. When I spoke, my voice colder and steadier than I expected. Was any of it real? He froze, his shoulders tensing. He turned slowly, his face a carefully composed mask of surprise. But I could see the flicker of apprehension in his eyes. Alara, I didn't see you there. Oh, I've been here the whole time, I said, taking a few steps closer, my heels clicking menacingly on the wooden floor. I've been watching the performance. It's very convincing. The esteemed professor, the devoted family man. Tell me, Julian, when do you find the time to rehearse? His composure cracked. That's not fair. You don't understand the complexities, the obligations. I understand that you looked at me like I was a piece of furniture. I shot back, my voice rising, the ice around my heart beginning to break. You stood there with your perfect wife, in your perfect life, and you looked at me like I was nothing. After everything, after the hotel, after you made me feel. Was that all a lie? Am I just your dirty little secret? A game you play to feel alive before you go home to your sensible, boring prose? The words hit their mark. A flash of pain crossed his face. No, he said, his voice low and urgent. He moved toward me, closing the distance between us. No, it was never a game. You have to believe me. What happens with us? It's the only real thing. Real? I laughed, a harsh, broken sound. It's real enough for you to hide in the shadows, but not real enough to acknowledge in the light? What do you even see when you look at me, Julian? A temporary diversion? A silly, infatuated student you can discard when the semester ends? My vision was blurring with hot, angry tears. All the pain and humiliation from that night, from the silent week that followed, came pouring out. I was no longer the cool, collected accuser. I was just a girl, heartbroken and utterly lost. He reached for me then, his hands coming up to cup my face, his thumbs gently wiping away my tears. His expression was one I had never seen before, not of passion or desire, but of a deep, ancient anguish, a pain that seemed to have nothing to do with me. He looked at me, but it felt like he was looking through me, at something far, far away. Don't cry, he whispered, his voice thick with a strange, desperate sorrow. Lily, please, don't cry. The name hung in the air between us. A foreign object, cold and sharp. My tears stopped instantly. The world seemed to tilt on its axis. What? I asked, my voice a dead, flat whisper. What did you just call me? The blood drained from his face. His hands dropped from my cheeks as if they'd been burned. He looked utterly exposed, a man whose deepest, most protected secret had just been ripped out into the light. He stumbled back a step, shaking his head. I'm sorry. I misspoke. But it was too late. The name, Lily, was a key, and it had just unlocked 1,000 tiny, confusing moments. The intensity of his gaze the first time we spoke, The way he sometimes looked at me with a sad, wistful nostalgia that I couldn't understand, it all clicked into place with a horrifying, sickening clarity. "Who is Lily?" I demanded, my voice dangerously quiet. There was nowhere for him to hide. The truth was out, and it was cornered. He sank onto the edge of the stage, his head in his hands. "Come back to my office," he said, his voice muffled. "I will tell you everything." In the funereal silence of his office, the story came out not in a rush, but in pained, halting pieces. Lily was his first love, the great love of his life, from before his career, before his wife, before the man he had become. They had been young, inseparable, their future, a brilliant, sunlit path. And then it had ended. A rainy night, a slick road, a car crash. He had been driving. She had died instantly. For 25 years, he had carried that moment, that guilt, that ghost. Then, he told me, on the first day of the semester, he had looked out over a sea of new faces, and he had seen her. "It wasn't just a resemblance, Alara," he said, his voice raw. "It was everything. The way your hair catches the light, the way you tilt your head when you're thinking, the eyes. My God, your eyes are exactly the same." My entire world began to dissolve. He confessed that his initial fascination, his pursuit of me, had been a desperate, subconscious attempt to speak to her one last time. He was chasing a ghost, and I was the vessel. Every conversation, every touch, every moment of what I thought was our intimacy had been a three-way affair. Me, him, and the specter of a dead woman. "When I'm with you," he admitted, his voice breaking, "when I hold you, for just a little while. She's not gone." The words were meant to be a confession of his profound love for her, but to me they were a death sentence for us. My specialness, the feeling of being uniquely seen and understood by him, was a complete and utter fraud. He hadn't seen me. He had seen a convenient mirage. He hadn't been drawn to my mind. He'd been searching for echoes of hers. He hadn't been making love to Alara. He had been fucking a ghost. I felt a profound sense of nullification, as if my own identity had been completely erased. I was a stand-in, a body double in the tragic romance of his past. The revelation didn't feel like a betrayal. It was worse. A betrayal implies you mattered in the first place. This felt like I had never existed at all. I stood up, my body feeling hollowed out, empty. He looked up at me, his face pleading for something, understanding, absolution. I didn't know what, but I had nothing left to give him. The love, the anger, the hurt, it had all been drained away, replaced by a vast, silent emptiness. I walked out of his office, out of the story of Julian and Lily, and back into a world where I no longer knew who I was. To say that I was heartbroken would be an understatement. A heart, to be broken, must first exist as a whole. What I felt was not a fracture, but a complete and total erasure. The revelation of Lily had hollowed me out, leaving a silent, echoing void where my sense of self used to be. I was a ghost haunting my own life, my movements automatic, my expressions a hollow pantomime of a person who was no longer there. The affair was over. It had never really begun. How could I continue a relationship with a man who was in love with a dead woman I simply happened to resemble? I deleted his number. I archived his emails. I walked through the world with the quiet, devastating certainty that I was invisible. But a ghost, I learned, is a difficult thing to get rid of. After a week of my icy silence, Julian began to pursue me with a desperation that bordered on frantic. He was no longer the confident, composed professor. He was a man unraveling. He sent emails, not to my student account, but to the private one we had used. His words a desperate plea. "Alara, please talk to me. I know how it sounded, but it's not the whole story. You're not her. I need to make you understand." He would wait for me after class, his eyes pleading, looking haunted and lost. I ignored him. My silence, my only weapon, my only shield. But he was relentless. His desperation was a hook, and despite my best efforts, it snagged on a dark, self-destructive part of me I didn't know existed. A morbid curiosity began to fester in the void inside me. What would happen if I saw him again? And a more dangerous question followed. Could I make him see me? Could I, through some act of will, of passion, of sheer physical presence, exorcise the ghost of Lily and force him to see the woman of flesh and blood who was right in front of him? I agreed to meet him, one last time, not for love, not for pleasure, but for war. The battleground was one of our anonymous motels, the room identical to the others, with its faint smell of bleach and regret. The air was thick with tension, heavy with the weight of his ghost. He started to talk, his voice desperate, trying to explain, to patch together the beautiful lie we had once shared. The resemblance, it's what made me notice you, Alara. I can't deny that, he said, his hands gesturing helplessly. But it was a door, and when I walked through it, I found you. Your mind, your fire, the way you challenge everything, that's you, not her. The words were a balm I refused to accept. How can I ever believe that? I asked, my voice flat and cold. Every time you've touched me, whose skin were you feeling? Every time you whispered my name, was hers the one you were tasting? His face crumpled with pain, but I felt no pity. I felt nothing but a cold, hard resolve. I had come here for one reason, to replace her, to overwrite his memory of her with the undeniable carnal reality of me. I closed the distance between us, and the power dynamic shifted in an instant. This time, I was the hunter. I pushed him back against the flimsy pressboard desk, my hands flat on his chest. I kissed him, and it was not a kiss of passion, but of angry, desperate possession. I bit his lip, tasting the salt of his blood, a primitive, carnal act of branding. He was a battleground, and I was determined to win. I unbuttoned his shirt, my fingers quick and sure, my touch not a caress but a claim. I pushed him toward the bed, and he went, a look of shocked, pained confusion in his eyes. This was not the adoring, pliant student he knew. This was a woman fighting for her very existence. The sex that followed was not an act of love. It was a violent, desperate exorcism. I was on top of him, my body moving with a frantic, punishing rhythm, my hair a wild curtain around us. I wasn't surrendering to pleasure. I was wielding it like a weapon. I rode him with a fury that was born of my own erasure, each thrust an assertion. I am here. I am real. See me. I looked down at his face, at the conflict in his eyes, the mixture of arousal and anguish. I needed more. I needed to hear it. I leaned down, my lips brushing his ear, my voice a ragged, demanding whisper. Say my name, Julian. He groaned, his eyes squeezed shut. Say it, I commanded, my hips grinding down on him. Alara, he gasped. It wasn't enough. Who am I? I panted, my body slick with sweat. Tell me who I am. Tell me you see me. His eyes opened and he looked up at me, his gaze unfocused, lost somewhere between the present and the past. I see you, he choked out, but the words felt hollow, a desperate attempt to give me what I wanted. I knew, even as my body convulsed in a sharp, almost painful climax, that I had failed. His own release was a shuddering, desperate gasp, the release of a man in torment, not in ecstasy. In the aftermath, there was no tender silence, no intimate afterglow. We lay on opposite sides of the bed, the space between us a cold, dead chasm. The room was silent except for our harsh, ragged breathing. The fierce, angry passion had burned itself out, leaving behind nothing but the cold, gray ash of our shared tragedy. I had waged my war, used my body as my only weapon, and I had lost. I understood in that moment, with a clarity that was as calm as it was devastating, that I could never win. I could never fuck a ghost out of a man's heart. Every touch, every kiss, would always be a question. The act hadn't made me feel more real. It had only amplified my own hollowness. I had tried to exorcise Lily's ghost, but instead I had only proven that I was the more spectral one in the room. Silently, I swung my legs off the bed. I gathered my clothes from the floor and dressed without looking at him. He didn't speak. There was nothing left to say. The desperate fight had unraveled the last frayed thread that connected us. I walked to the door, and for the first time, I didn't look back. I left him there, alone on the bed, a prisoner of his past, and I walked out into the night, a ghost finally letting go of the man she was trying to haunt. The final encounter in that desolate motel room was a cauterizing wound. It burned away the last vestiges of hope, of anger, of love, leaving behind only the clean, sterile tissue of reality. The affair was a corpse, and I had spent the last several weeks walking around with the stench of its decay clinging to me. I moved through the final days of the semester in a numb haze. The campus, once a landscape of thrilling possibilities and secret dangers, now felt like a stage set for a play that had already ended. I wrote my final papers, took my exams, and packed my books into cardboard boxes, all with the detached efficiency of a stranger managing the affairs of a person who had recently died. Graduation loomed, not as a triumphant finish line, but as the edge of a cliff. My carefully drawn, straight-line life had been shattered, and I was now standing at the precipice, with no map and no destination. It was into this void that Mark, in his infinite and heartbreaking goodness, chose to shine a light. He must have sensed my distance, my strange melancholy, and mistaken it for the natural anxiety of a student facing the end of her academic life. He decided, in his loving, logical way, that the solution was certainty. He took me to dinner at a small, romantic Italian restaurant, the one where we had celebrated our first anniversary 4 years earlier. The air was filled with the scent of garlic and old wine, and the candlelight cast a soft, forgiving glow on his handsome, earnest face. He talked about our future as if it were a solid, tangible thing, a house whose blueprints he held in his hands. He spoke of Boston, of the apartment he'd already scouted for us, of holidays with our families, of a life of shared joys and comfortable certainties. Every word was a gentle turn of a knife in my gut. He was describing a beautiful life, and all I could think was that I was a cancer that would poison it from the inside out. After dinner, as we stood by the river that wound its way through the old part of town, he took my hands in his. "Alara," he began, his voice thick with an emotion that made my stomach clench with guilt. "These last 4 years, you're my best friend. You're my home. I know things have been stressful with graduation, and the future feels big and scary, but I want you to know that you'll never have to face it alone." And then, he dropped to one knee. He pulled a small velvet box from his pocket and opened it. Inside, a diamond glittered, clear and perfect and brilliant, catching the light from the street lamp above. "Alara Vance, will you marry me?" The world around me seemed to rush away, leaving only the sight of this good man, on his knee, offering me his entire world, his whole, untarnished heart. The ring wasn't just a piece of jewelry. It was a lifeboat. It was a promise of safety, of normalcy, of a future where I could pretend the last few months had never happened. I could say yes, and I could spend the rest of my life performing the role of the happy wife, a ghost in my own marriage, my soul slowly rotting with the secret I carried. Looking into his hopeful, loving eyes, a wave of self-loathing so powerful it almost buckled my knees washed over me. I couldn't do it. But in that moment, I was too much of a coward to tell the truth. "Mark," I whispered, my voice trembling. It's beautiful. Oh my God, this is so much. Can you just give me a night to think? It's everything I've ever wanted, He stood, his smile faltering slightly with confusion, but he nodded, ever the patient, understanding man. "Of course," he said, slipping the ring onto my finger. It felt as heavy as an anchor. The weight of that ring on my finger was a declaration of war on my own indecision. It forced my hand. There was one last ghost to face, one final question that needed an answer before I could choose a path. The next afternoon, I went to Julian's office. I didn't call ahead. I walked in, my heart a slow, steady beat, my emotions packed away in ice. He was at his desk, grading papers, and he looked up, startled. The haunted, desperate man of the past few weeks was gone, replaced by a tired, resigned academic. The air in the room, once charged with eroticism and drama, was now just stale and sad. I stood before his desk, the diamond on my finger feeling obscene in this setting. "Mark asked me to marry him last night," I said, my voice clear and even. There was no accusation, no plea. It was a simple statement of fact. A flicker of something pain, Regret crossed his face before he masked it. "I see," he said quietly. I held my ground. Before I answer him, I have to know. Not what I want to hear, not a line from a poem, just the truth. Is there any version of the future, any possible world where you and I have a life together? A real one. In the daylight. I was offering him one last chance to be the man from my fantasies, the man who would slay dragons and burn down his life for love. Instead, he just looked at me with a profound, soul-deep sadness. He slowly shook his head. "No, Alara," he said, his voice barely a whisper, but the words were as final as a gravestone. "Number, I can't leave my wife. I'm too old, or too tired, or too much of a coward. My life is a structure I built a long time ago, and I don't have the strength to tear it down, even if the foundation is rotten." He looked at me, his eyes filled with a genuine, terrible regret. What we have, it was real, but it can only exist here, in these rooms, in the dark. I can offer you a lifetime of stolen moments, but I can't offer you a life. And there it was, the final, brutal, liberating truth. My two futures were laid out before me. Path A was a life with Mark, a beautiful, sunlit house where I would live as a ghost, haunted forever by the lies I'd have to tell to sustain it. Path B was a life with Julian, a series of dark, secret rooms where I would live as his ghost, always hidden, always secondary, a footnote in his life and a rival to a dead woman. And in that quiet, sad office, I finally understood. The choice was never between Mark and Julian. It was between a life of lies and a life of truth. Between being a ghost in someone else's story and becoming the author of my own, no matter how terrifying or lonely that might be. I looked at Julian, this brilliant, broken man, and for the first time, I felt nothing but a quiet, aching pity. He was a prisoner of his own past, and I had almost allowed him to make me his cellmate. "I understand," I said, and I truly did. "Goodbye, Julian." I turned and walked out of his office, leaving the affair, the obsession, and the ghost of Lily behind me. I was walking into the unknown, with no ring on my finger and no man by my side, but for the first time, in a long time, I was walking toward myself. I walked out of Julian's office and did not stop walking until I was standing in front of Mark's apartment. The diamond on my finger felt like a shackle, each of its perfect facets a reflection of a future I could not and would not claim. He opened the door with a smile that died when he saw my face. In the living room, the room where we had built our comfortable, happy life, I demolished it with a few quiet words. I slid the ring off my finger and placed it on the coffee table between us. It sat there, glittering under the lamplight, a star from a galaxy that was no longer mine. I didn't tell him about Julian. To tell him the truth would have been a final selfish act of cruelty, a way to unburden my conscience by shattering his. He didn't deserve that. This was my sin, and my punishment was to bear its weight alone. I told him a different kind of truth. "Mark," I said, my voice quiet but firm, the tears I shed for him, for the good man I had wronged, genuine. "I cannot marry you. Not because I don't love you, but because I am not the person you love, the girl you asked to marry you. She doesn't exist anymore, and I cannot spend the rest of my life, and yours, pretending that she does." He was heartbroken. He was confused. He begged for reasons I couldn't give, for explanations that would only hurt him more. He asked if there was someone else. I looked him in the eye and gave him my final lie, a lie that was a strange and painful kind of mercy. "No," I said, "there is no one else." And in a way, that was true. I was leaving them both. An hour later, I walked out of his apartment, leaving behind a good man, a beautiful ring, and the smoldering ruins of the life I was supposed to want. I graduated a week later, a ghost in a cap and gown, shook the dean's hand, and never looked back. That was 7 years ago. The city I live in now is a world away from the quiet Gothic campus of my past. It is a city of steel and glass, of noise and ambition. I work as an editor for a small, respected publishing house. I spend my days with words, shaping stories, but I am careful with my own. I am successful. I am independent. I am, by all accounts, a woman who has her life together. I am also alone, but I am not lonely. I learned in the crucible of that final semester the profound and empowering difference between the two. My affair with Julian left scars, of course. They are not the ugly, weeping kind, but the fine silver lines that are visible only in a certain light. There is a guardedness to me now, a quiet reserve that keeps most people at a comfortable distance. I am fiercely intolerant of secrets, of the small, polite lies that people tell each other to maintain a fragile peace. The peace I found is not fragile. It is hard-won, and I protect it ferociously. The past rarely visits me, but when it does, it comes as a phantom on the senses. Sometimes, on a rainy autumn evening, I'll walk past an old bookstore and the smell of decaying paper and damp wool will waft out, and for a heart-stopping second, I am back in his office, the air thick with desire and the sound of rain against a tall Gothic window. Occasionally, I'll catch the scent of sandalwood in a crowded subway car, and my heart will give a strange, painful lurch. These moments are no longer agonizing. They are just echoes, faint and distant, reminders of a girl who once set her own life on fire just to feel a different kind of warmth. I never looked Julian up. I never found out what became of him. His story, and the story of his ghost, are no longer mine to read. And Mark, I heard through a mutual friend, is happy. He is married, with 2 children, and lives in that beautiful house in Boston. He has the life we were supposed to have. Knowing this brings me a quiet, profound relief. His goodness was not a casualty of my chaos. My final semester was a story of lies, a season of transgression that cost me everything I thought I wanted, but in exchange for the life I lost, it gave me my own. I was not the heroine of Julian's story or the happy wife in Mark's. I had to learn to be the protagonist in my own, a story that is quieter, more complex, and infinitely more true. And so I am left with a question, one that still visits me in the most honest hours of the night, when the city is asleep and the only sound is my own breathing. Are some loves, however wrong, however destructive, the only fires hot enough to burn away the person we are pretending to be and forge us into the person we were truly meant to become?